Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to start now. The session, Drones at the Margins, looking at RPAs for community and citizen-led applications. So I'm Philip Boucher from the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission here in Brussels. And these RPAs, remotely piloted aviation systems, which we'll just call drones for now, aerial vehicles that fly without an onboard pilot, and also the systems that support them to do that. Most people will be familiar with them as military technologies that are used for surveillance and combat operations. But recently, I'm sure many of you are aware that they've started to be used for non-military purposes, like environmental monitoring, security, emergency response, surveillance, and also recreation, people just using them for fun. And this development has prompted some research into some of the privacy and data protection implications of this growing civil drone sector, including a large report published by a trilateral commissioned by DG Enterprise recently at the end of last year. In this session, we wanted to push this discussion a little bit further to consider the privacy and data protection implications of less mainstream applications and marginal users of these civil drones, where the operators perhaps might not fully understand or appreciate the privacy and data protection responsibilities, or they might not have the resources in terms of expertise, time, or budget to meet their responsibilities effectively. So our aims in this session was to look at some examples of marginal applications and how they might differ from more mainstream state and commercial uses, to look at how privacy and data protection aspects of these applications have been managed, and also scanning the horizon for emerging problems and solutions. So we have 4 speakers with 10 minutes each, and then there'll be a 5-minute response to the panel by our moderator. And we'll use the rest of the time, which since we started late, will probably be about 20 minutes for an open discussion. So I'll ask you to hold your questions until the end, and we'll take them together during these 20 minutes, especially because some of them might be interesting for the whole panel rather than just the one speaker. So we'll start with the first one. We have Katie Bartzen Culver, Assistant Professor and Associate Director at the Center for Journalism Ethics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the USA. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Philip. I appreciate it. So I'm here to talk about journalism and the applications and uses of UAVs, or we'll call them drones, in journalism. I'm going to try not to drone on or make too many bad puns. So I became interested in this marginal use with the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. I study the ethics of emerging technologies, and when this happened, great deal of suspicion that the government was not being accurate in relaying information about the disaster and about radiation leakage. And I thought, well, it would be so interesting if we could get some kind of radiation sensor deployed to do this sort of thing. And a friend of mine said, well, for that you need a drone. And from there, I just became more and more interested in these applications. So I study this primarily, or almost entirely, in the US context. In the US, we are on this breakneck deadline to try to get commercial drones integrated into the national airspace. The Federal Aviation Administration is the agency in charge of this. The national airspace in the United States, when you consider all of the operations that would use it, looks something like that graphic. It's not a small task for this agency to engage in these regulations. Flight restricted zones exist beyond the national airspace, which is generally considered 500 feet above the highest object in a space. For drone technology, they focused primarily on commercial restrictions, on limiting people who would use drones commercially. So this FAA Modernization and Reform Act that was passed in 2008, I had to call that to mind, again, tries to dictate that these will be commercial drones will be integrated into the national airspace by the end of this year. So when I started studying this in 2011, that seemed crazy. Now that it's actually 2015, it seems absolutely nightmarish. The FAA has just engaged in its very first agreement with a journalistic entity to test the use of drones. That's with CNN. That happened just this month. And so if we're only beginning that experimentation now, it's impossible to imagine that we will actually have reasonable regulation in place by the end of this year. Why this breakneck pace? Why this rush? It's because there are predictions that in the US alone, this would be a $90 billion industry within a decade. So there's a lot of money. As with all things all things in this sector, money is a very important driver. So how could UAVs be used in journalism? It doesn't take long to think of the many, many different ways that we could imagine it. Just to use a hurricane as an example, first and foremost, drones are able to very easily capture aerial images. So imagine the devastation of Hurricane Sandy, using drones to capture video and still images of the aftermath, of the path of the storm, of the damage that's done to homes and businesses and that sort of thing. Drones are also capable at very, very low cost of doing live streamed video, of putting out video from within the event itself. And so obviously you wouldn't be putting people at personal risk. You would have less safety concerns if you were deploying a drone. The higher end drones are capable of digital mapping, so doing orthographically corrected imagery to map particular areas. This is particularly interesting in the environmental journalism context. And then also gathering sensed data. So in a hurricane, you could get wind speeds and all that sort of data. So there are plenty of ways that we can deploy them. The questions then arise how to deploy them. So just to give you an example, this is from a natural gas explosion in the Harlem area in New York City. And this is done by just a hobbyist who has a very low-end drone. He probably paid $1,500 for it at the time he bought it. I could now probably get it for $500. It's mounted with a GoPro camera, and then it can stream directly and be captured on YouTube. So this is someone, just an individual. He's not a journalist, excuse me, but he captured this. He did very responsibly go and talk to first responders at the scene, ask if he could use the drone. Did it in, very carefully, and when they asked him to stop, he did indeed stop. And then this was picked up by the Daily News and all sorts of other news outlets, getting a view of the explosion that was not available through any other means. So certainly not a reporter who would be on the ground could not capture this, and you couldn't get a helicopter anywhere near that in New York City. So it's providing information to the audience that we otherwise could not safely or securely or cost effectively, I guess I would say. Okay, so there's lots and lots of potential there, but there's also a lot of public suspicion about these technologies. This is just one bit of data from the Pew Research Center. They were looking at people's comfort levels with emerging technologies, and you can see here that U.S. airspace open to personal drones. 63% of respondents said that that would make the situation worse, not better. Only 22% said they would make it better. So if you look at that, it's on par with people talking about parents being able to alter children's DNA. So something that the public is very, very suspicious of. Something also that legislatures are very, very suspicious of. So in the US, the FAA is responsible for governing or regulating the national airspace, but there are also all of these individual entities right down to the municipal level that can regulate drone use. And so there have been some draconian laws directed specifically at journalism. In Texas, for instance, they have criminalized the use of drones to capture content dealing with specific things that people would report on, such as flying over meat processing plants to try to capture data and images of people contaminating watersheds, for instance. So some of them have been sort of accidentally difficult for journalism, and some of them have been specifically pointed at journalism. So the enforcement actions that we've seen so far, there have been some aimed at news organizations, some aimed specifically at academic institutions. There are two big drone research centers for journalism, one at the University of Missouri, one at the University of Nebraska. Both received cease and desist orders to stop their research on these areas. Most of greatest concern to me is the FAA's interpretation that news organizations can be held accountable for using other people's content that was captured using these technologies. And that gets into a whole level of new comfort we seem to have with governmental organizations in the US. It had long been sacrosanct that as long as we weren't violating the law to obtain the material, it was publishable. That seems to not be the case with drones and all sorts of other things. Okay, so let me turn to privacy, which is why we're all here. So in the US, and I think in a lot of other arenas, we see privacy as the protection of personal space. So the idea is that where you are matters. Framed roughly as where do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. Certainly you have that within your own home, on your own property, but when you're in a public space, you have less protection. That's how the old adage goes. I think that that runs headlong, though, into a public that's very, very concerned about this movement from simple observation into surveillance. Technology used to take what we can see into something that we can surveil. And that's something that I don't think news organizations, or at least the ones that I've studied, are appropriately understanding. They're not getting the public discomfort. They don't see the connection between people worrying about, the Snowden revelations and taking that into what CNN is doing. So there's a lot of public discomfort, but not a lot of news organization recognition of that. And I think the idea that an ethicist would put forward as opposed to a lawyer is that privacy is not merely a construct of where you are. It's part of who you are. So privacy is, and this is my favorite quote, privacy is a moral good. It's not just a legal issue. And so it's something that if it's part of our unique humanness, it's part of our humanity, and when it's gone, part of that humanity is gone as well. And that's something I think we have to recognize when we're deploying drones in journalism. So some of the considerations I would encourage people to think about. Number one, using drones in a narrow way. So that is to answer a specific set of questions dealing with a specific story idea, rather than deploying them more broadly, engaging in surveillance and letting stories arise from that. And these apply not just to images captured or information sensed with drones. I would say it applies much more broadly across all data gathering in journalism. And that is, we want to keep it limited to a narrow, specific story idea so that we're not broadly encroaching on people's lives. Second, minimization. And that means using the data that's sensed or the information that's gathered specifically for that story and not engaging in broad secondary uses. Excuse me. I think we could do a lot better with being transparent with our publics about our reporting practices, why, when, and where UAVs would be used, and not being opaque about what that means for them. I also think we should be much more concerned about accountability, about opening conversations to the public and including the public in those. Right now, media ethics globally tends to be about internal conversations, and I think we need to move away from that. And then finally, protecting, doing a very, very good job of protecting the data that we do gather from any kind of hacking and also from governmental uses. That's something that I think is a real danger. Finally, I would say I'd be worried about, in this case, the revenge effects of technology. The revenge effects of technology. And those are the unintended consequences. When we deploy a technology to answer a specific problem, it sometimes creates other problems. So in the case of UAVs, we were trying to minimize casualties, but it actually increased the ability to kill and allowed us to do it at a distance. It's the same thing in journalism. We can do new kinds of reporting, and that's all good. That's laudable. But it also threatens credibility of journalism if the public is not along with us.
Thanks very much, Katie. We'll move on to the second speaker straight away. Questions held for the end, please. Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick from the Central European University in Hungary.
Sorry, that was me. My fault. You look like you knew what you were doing.
Yeah, I did. Beware. caveat for the next 10 minutes I'm going to be talking. I look like I knew what I was doing. So my name is Joy-Fitzpatrick. I'm an American educator, academic at Central European University, which is an American graduate school in Budapest, in Hungary, which for those of you following politics in the region, Hungary has had some challenges with its commitment to democracy in recent times. And so we're actually, I'm working with students in something we're calling the sort of a SPP drone lab. I'm at a School of Public Policy. And so I'm presenting a particular sort of case use around our use of small UAVs, small drones in urban context. What I'm about to say, I'm happy to take questions and criticisms for some of the things I'm about to present. But I think it actually presents a pretty interesting sort of case use for the conversation we're having now. So I came at this from a question about why it is that the human rights community that I'm usually part of as a social movement scholar isn't having conversations about the ways that these small platforms can be used in order to do the sorts of public good acts that you're going to hear folks here talking more about, like helping journalists to do their job in a better way, giving new perspectives on social movements, and this sort of thing. Tracking hard-to-reach populations. My other work is on human trafficking, forced labor in India. So using drones to map kiln sites is a really interesting thing in my mind. But starting out with this first case use of social movements. And so the first thing to do, right, is to clarify that we're really talking about several different uses, right? One is by the military and the second is by corporations, and that tends to be, I think, what the American public thinks of and the European public when they're polled in as we've now got polling data for over about 18 months or so. These concerns are over first the military and then realizing this could be DHL and people aren't sure they want a drone landing in their front yard. So I'm not sure how to read some of this data that we're getting since we don't have, I think, a full-throated and coherent argument yet for civil society uses. This is what I'm saying for the next couple of minutes is from an article that's just come out called Drones Over Maidan in the Journal of International Affairs, in which I argue this here. And also lay out a typology of uses. So I'm most interested in the things that are underlined here. So I'm interested in not material and technical disruption and not in drones use in the arts. Both are really interesting, but are at opposite ends of a spectrum where I'm looking more at contested political actions, social movements, human rights, these sorts of things. So particularly around corporate accountability, the mention of using drones to document agribusiness in the United States, for example, state accountability in conflict, documenting in Sri Lanka how the state has actually treated refugee populations during the war there. Human rights monitoring, I gave this example of kilns in rural India, and social movements and protest, which is the case use that I'll be talking about today. So I think this calls for a larger ethical framework that journalists are working on these sorts of approaches, the humanitarian aid communities working on these sorts of approaches. The ACLU in the United States is working on these approaches to actually challenge law enforcement to not use and or not weaponize and or protect data on drones that they may equip with cameras in order to engage in surveillance. So these conversations, though, are happening. So these ethical frameworks are being developed within particular national and use silos. So we have, let's say, the United States conversations about what would ethics look like for the military or the police, or what would it look like for DHL, for example. But I'm arguing in this paper that we need to have a larger sort of ethical framework that looks at subsidiarity. Can we be doing this with another technology? We like to say drones are going to change everything, and then we say, but don't monitor us because actually this is just like a flying camera. Well, which is it? We were having this conversation earlier. Sorry, I was having this conversation with somebody earlier. Physical and material security, the simple act of, I'm going to show you footage of us flying over crowds. Most people would not do this. Maybe we shouldn't. You can tell me about what you think of that later. But physical and material security, which is something that's getting easier to regulate with the incorporation of parachutes and other sorts of innovations that are lagging the development of the platforms themselves. Do no harm principle. If you're flying a larger commercial size drone in an area that has had drone strikes, but you're delivering aid, how do you not re-traumatize communities? I'm borrowing this from UAviators' own guidelines and principles, which are focused on the humanitarian uses. Newsworthiness, is this something that actually advances the greater good? Is this something that is coming from journalism? So I'm not inventing these. I'm stealing these from different ethical frameworks and bundling them and saying, not just in the not just small drones in the United States and not just big drones in Yemen, but how is it that we can actually have an ethical platform that works across these contexts? Finally, and certainly not least, respect for privacy and for data security. And these are questions of observability, if we can actually discern gait or facial recognition from drone footage. This is something I am, as a social movement scholar, distinctly disinterested in giving to the state when social movements are engaged in challenging authorities over new laws or new rights, new recognitions, to say that they want something or don't want something. I think that it's citizens and non-citizens alike should have the right to protest without fear that they're being scanned. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, Germans think it means something completely different than the Brits, right? So there's a CCT camera. What's the CCT camera per populace in the UK, right? So there's more cameras than people, and Germany is understandably furious over the Snowden revelations. So what we mean by privacy is a larger conversation, and to have in each national context or sort of particular case use will have, I think, a different perception of this, and I'm trying to flag that that's a larger conversation. So our second, so the case use I mentioned earlier is, as a social movement scholar, we've been estimating how large crowds are in the same way since about 1967, when a scholar at Berkeley decided that he would go up to his office off of Sproul Plaza and use some basic math to figure out how many people were protesting during the free speech movement there. This gives us footage a lot like this, which is at an angle of incidence in which you cannot see people who are shorter, or you cannot, umbrellas cause trouble. You can see this, lamp post over here, flags. This creates sort of angle of incidence issues related to whether or not it's easy to estimate the crowd. We have this slide will be online later, so I'm going to skip past it, but we took these basic approaches and applied them to footage obtained with a drone. So this is a crowd of an unestimated size in Budapest. It has no constrained points of ingress and egress, which means from a civil engineering standpoint, in a stampede, nobody would die. But if you want to know how many people were there, it's impossible. So there's benefits and drawbacks to this approach. We essentially did, you can see here down the media, I'm going to start from the bottom. The media said there were tens of thousands of people there, which is what the media likes to say. Had this been a political protest, the local government would have said there were hundreds of people, and the protesters would have said there was upwards of 1 million. So this is the kind of event that has gotten has been the subject of distinctly different estimates and inferences for political reasons often, but sometimes for methodological reasons as well. We determined in our sort of expert coder estimate that there were 36,000 people there. We then piloted and ultimately finalized and formalized a coding guide for graduate students who had no contact with this project, no contact with this sort of work before, sort of international relations major and a IR major, and gave them a 10-minute training with a single sheet of paper that said, here's what you want to do, see what how dense you estimate each square to be, add it all up, which is what this just said with more words. And they estimated that there were between 37,100 and 37,700 people. So those are the two different estimates. And our estimate doesn't fall within those, but it's generally improves, I think, in either case on the tens of thousands. And those of you who want to geek out about this had an intercoded reliability of 0.7, which is how well did any particular cell estimate match with one another across the two people. So the punchline is, this does a pretty good job, certainly better than the media did at the time, at estimating how many people were there. This matters if, as I mentioned earlier, this is at a concert, but it also matters if these are political claims. We went on to use the drone during large anti-internet tax protests that happened in October, and so we have footage that we then worked with civil society to distribute in a sort of like high-impact music under it, properly edited sort of way. And that was like a social movement product, right? That didn't allow us to estimate because Hungarians protest in the dark. Why is this? Every protest happens after sunset. I think it has to do with the fact that nobody wants to be monitored and documented. I don't know if this is true or not. But this raises two questions that I'll finish on. The first is what to do about anonymity and about privacy, right? What we do is we don't activate the camera until we're a certain a number of meters up, and then we can't actually differentiate between people's faces. Do we really do that, or do we just say we do that? There's no way to tell. So we're working on actually mounting the drones with infrared cameras, which would give us, we could automate this process then with machine visual learning and actually do a better job estimating than humans perhaps, but also it will remove any question of whether or not this footage could be obtained by the police and later used for facial recognition and then sort of punitive actions by the state. The second question also relates to whether or not we can film in the dark. And so infrared would also solve that problem. And here I'll end it. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin. The next speaker is Apostolos Malatras, a scientific officer at the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission in Italy. Yeah, do you want to go over there?
And do you want to give him the...
They're going to trust me to do this. I can't believe it.
Hi, good morning. My name is Apostolos Malatras, and I'm with the Joint Research Center in Italy. I'm with the Institute for the Protection and Security of the Citizen, and in our unit, the Digital Citizen Security Unit. We are working on different research projects dealing with technological advancements having to do with cybersecurity, data protection, and privacy. We are in the midst of protecting the fundamental rights of the citizen in this respect and respecting the EU security needs. So clearly when the new technology of drones came about and the trend with drones, the buzzword came about a few years ago, it was a thing that we really caught our interest, and we wanted to deal with it in order to see what we could do in terms of security and how this could be how the technology of the drones could be used in the context of protecting and or affecting citizens' privacy. In this respect, there has been a lot of work on drones. And okay, I'm pretty sure you've all seen the nice videos going around on Wired, on The Verge and everything, funny videos with drones doing a lot of different things. They share many common characteristics. Usually a drone is owned by a single person or by an organization. The thing is, a person has a drone, goes around and, I don't know, maybe uses it to record the video of her wedding, to record a sports event. Governments use it for crowd control also, for military uses. Companies use it for delivery of products. Clearly, and it's evident, okay, this is a very powerful device. It's carrying with it a lot of sensors, primarily a camera. It has a very serious privacy concern. So going around people, recording them, recording their faces, because the cameras are of very high quality, this is something that needs to be taken into account. Also, there are other issues involved, data protection issues. So, as we said before, as I mentioned before, it's not only cameras and photos that are being collected, but other kinds of media, for example, audio and video. And this raises issues, serious concerns with data protection. Selfies nowadays raise these issues, let alone drones. Obviously, and it was of quite interest to us to try to study all the technological issues concerned with this kind of new technologies. There are safety and security concerns in the sense that it's not a very stable technology. If you go and buy a cheap drone from Media World or another a major establishment, this is not the most stable technology. If you go and crash it on somebody's car, which I almost did with mine when I was playing around, yeah, you should be careful with that. Another issue that is quite prominent, especially in Europe with 28 different member states, is the fact of the regulations. Some countries have specific regulations regarding drones. We saw before, for example, that in the States it's much more regulated. In Europe, it's not exactly this case. It's getting there. There is a major push to go for a single EU regulation, but we're not quite there yet. And altogether, technological challenges. uses of drones are quite a few. So major uses are the commercial ones, which are envisaged up until now for delivery of products. We've seen some videos of deliveries of pizzas, for example. And mostly, and that's the common use, is the governmental use for military purposes. There is a clear distinction, and this is the distinction between different regulations in some countries of drone usage for commercial use and drones for recreational uses. What does recreational mean? It's a bit context dependent. Basically, it's for fun, but what qualifies as fun? For example, is drone journalism is something recreational use or commercial use? It's because you can make money out of it, but it's not really the standard way of making money out of this. And there have been also, and that's what we were interested in mostly, social uses of drones for different products of projects of social engagement and promoting development projects, especially in Africa, for the monitoring of wildlife. In this respect, our motivation was to study something, to start with an exploratory research project, to study some issues that were not covered or were not clearly covered until now in terms of the different research projects around there for drones. So our motivation was to answer a couple of questions, two exactly questions. What about drones that are not owned by a single person? What about drones that are being owned collectively by a community? And what uses could drones have in this context? And this is quite interesting for us because when one person is solely responsible for a drone, this person is responsible to take into account all the different regulations, all the different rules, and he's liable if something is to happen. What if a drone was collectively owned by a community? Who gets to regulate the usage of the drone? Who gets to protect the data that is being collected by the drone? Who gets to keep this data? So trying to find a nice plausible scenario for this kind of usage, a colleague of ours mentioned that he had a very nice apartment in a residence block in the island of Corsica, and that because it's a holiday home, they wanted to move around, they wanted to have a look at what is happening during the winter time or the time that they are not there. Many people were living there from countries from the UK or from northern countries. Installing a TV, you would need to ask the DPA to get permission to the Data Protection Authority to get permission to install the CCTV in the premises. Having a drone monitoring the houses up until now is not regulated, at least not there. So the idea would be to have a drone replacing the functionality of a CCTV system in order to monitor the apartment blocks for different security breaches. If a thief goes around, if some unexpected movement or a window breaks, the drone, which would be located in the premises, would automatically go to the location of the incident and try to record what it can record, basically video and audio. Then this would be reported back to the police, and the police would take care of this. Clearly, the drone would not go and chase the perpetrator, although that was brought on the table by some colleagues. And so our exploratory project, which is still ongoing, I have to say, it's on the usage of drones for residential surveillance. So we consider residential urban neighborhoods, and that the people there jointly put together a sum of money to buy a drone in order to build some sort of a neighborhood watch with the usage of drones. So all the residents of the residential area have credentials to use, secure credentials to use the drone, and they log into a system in order to record their preferences, when the drone should record the information about their house, what kind of alarms should be raised regarding their house, and so forth. And it's basically, we installed an alarm system that is monitoring the houses. So it's listening to alarms mainly triggered by citizens. So something is going on in my home, I hear a noise from the attic, for example, drone come and check what is going on in my roof. Or alarms being raised automatically. For example, as I mentioned before, a window breaking or a sudden very loud noise going on, or a community pool and you see some movement on the water of the community pool after dark when nobody is supposed to go there. And therefore, different types of automatic alarm triggering mechanism would be installed. The drone would then automatically pinpoint the location of the incident and fly above and record all the information as I mentioned before. The thing is that, this would lead to something like a drone neighborhood watch. Something that, it's an application that had not been envisaged so far, and we think that would be quite useful in this respect. There are a lot of challenges when building this system because we are in the process of starting to build the system and implementing in a realistic environment. The main problem is the autonomous flight version of the drone. So basically, as I mentioned before, most of the drones that are being bought by citizens and smaller groups of people are not the very expensive ones where they are very stable, you have autonomous flight control, and are very, very powerful. They are more iffy-based, iffy technologies, let's call them. So the autonomous flight is an issue, it's a challenge we try to solve, and especially when considering indoors environment where GPS is not available. For example, if you give the GPS coordinates of the drone, it would be much easier to send it to a particular location. If you want the drone to monitor a mall, for example, or a closed area, then it gets a bit more difficult. Clearly, as I mentioned before, there are many privacy concerns, yes. There are privacy concerns with anything, any kind of technology that is using drones, let alone when in this particular scenario, when the drone is not being owned by a single person. So the privacy risks are even exacerbated. Imagine what happens, you're recording data about a home. Why would somebody not trigger the alarm to go and monitor their neighborhoods, their neighbors to see what they're doing, if they're putting out their trash or not? Clearly, again, the security and privacy risks that are clear for drones are much, much worse in this particular scenario. In the case, for example, as I mentioned before, there was no need for a DPA authorization to install this technology. Would we need to introduce this, and who would be in charge for the data protection? Which of the neighbors? So the technological challenge that I mentioned also before. So we were in the process of building the system, and can we press? No. Can we press the button there? And basically, what we did was we tried to install this system to have an autonomous flight inside our offices, because we tried to do it in the parking lot, and I just bought a new car and don't want to damage it. So basically, we have this nice office space, and we want the drone to fly from one location to monitor this chair and the tableau on the other side of the room. So we gave we have an alarm being raised from the one end of the room and another one from the other end of the room. The drone is sitting quietly and listening to these commands. The drone is flying, has to go to this particular tableau. It goes there, it stops when it gets close enough, starts recording video, and then the alarm is being raised from the other end of the room where the chair is. The drone is going, recording what really happened to the chair. That's a big mystery. And okay, when it records all these things, operation functionality ceases, and it finishes. Clearly, okay, it seems like a simple scenario, but to implement this and to have the drone self-stabilize itself in the room, collect the data, and account for all the different variations in the wind drift inside the room automatically, it was a much more challenging and daunting at some points task. And this is the view from the drone, so as to see the quality of the images that are being collected that are of extreme, very, very good. So it's like 13 megapixels, so you can really distinguish a person within a crowd also. So just to bring forth the privacy concerns. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Apostolos. The next and final speaker is Serge Wich, I hope, Professor of Primate Biology at Liverpool John Moores University in the UK.
Thank you, Philip. Could you turn it on somehow?
Yeah, it's the last one.
So I'm a biologist, and I started to use drones for conservation purposes, and because we started a couple of years ago when commercial off-the-shelf systems were still very costly, we started to build these things ourselves. So these are a bunch of examples of the systems we build. We put a simple autopilot in it and a hobby plane, and basically it can fly, and you put a camera on it or a video. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the applications, and then basically going to bring up some questions on privacy issues of these applications, and maybe put it a little bit in a larger context of what conservation workers have been doing and probably should have been thinking about, but never really did. So I started to use these because there's a lot of land cover change in countries like Indonesia, and that threatens large iconic species that I've been studying for 20 years, orangutans in the wild. And we want to know where these animals are, how many there are, and how their habitat is changing. And doing that on foot is great work. It's great to be in a rainforest, but it's extremely costly and it's extremely not time efficient. So we can't keep track of the changes on the ground by doing things on the ground. So doing it from the air made good sense. So you get pictures like this of, in this case, orangutan nests from the drone. Orangutans make nests. All great apes make nests every day. You get pictures of other wildlife, rhinos in Chitwan National Park, for instance. You get imagery of different kinds of vegetation. And this is all has probably little implications for privacy use. But of course, we're also flying near boundaries of national parks where people are doing things. They are logging, they're taking other things out of these parks. So we don't necessarily always see people on these pictures, but we do see some of their actions. And that might lead to a reaction from park authorities when they would see these images, for instance. So we use them to try to monitor areas within national parks. This is the Gunung Leuser National Park within Indonesia. This is a flight from November 2013. It all looks very good. Nice rainforest. Then a couple of months later, another flight, and the forest is gone here, and the loggers kept this strip of trees along the river so that the park authorities wouldn't really see what would be happening when they would be on the river. But they didn't anticipate we would be flying over this. These images were brought by a local NGO to the park authorities, and they subsequently took action to oust the loggers from this national park, which is a protected area where these things are actually illegal. So I thought it's an interesting case because you don't actually see the people, but you see their actions, and that leads to some implications. The other case we use them for is to try to detect precious wildlife and people that try to hunt that precious wildlife. So this is a project in Nepal with WWF and the park authorities, trying to use them there. And we also use them in occasions like this, where they're used to protect marine conservation areas where people are illegally fishing. So they come in with boats. So the authorities there are using these systems to try to find these boats and then act upon those. So from a privacy point of view and from a biologist point of view, this is an area that we as biologists haven't really thought about a lot. Because this is a protected area, so people technically shouldn't be there, and they should only be there with permission, which is obviously not happening a lot. And most of the regulations in the countries that we work, if there are regulations at all, are concerning the safety issues of flying these systems and not the privacy issues. A lot of different countries where we work have very different views on privacy anyway. Indonesians, their concept of privacy is very different from the British concept of privacy where I live now. Indonesians are potentially much more they're much more less used to having a house with good privacy, etc. They live in a much more, they live closer to each other. It's much more open. They seem to have a very different view of these things. So that's, I think, something that's of interest to us working in this area. Do standard laws of privacy automatically apply to using drone systems, especially when you fly over protected areas? I truly do not know, but it's something that is important to start thinking about. So often these areas are only accessible for people with permits. So should we be telling these people that they might be on an image when a drone flies over that area? Maybe, maybe not. I do not know. So far, if I go with a permit into a national park, it will never say there might be a camera trap. We use remote cameras to take pictures of animals, but also of people illegally or legally walking into rainforests. That's not on any piece of paper, and that really takes a picture of you where you could be identified very easily. There's, I don't think, any regulation for that. Should there be signs around these parks, like there are, that it's illegal to enter, that there might now be a drone flying over and taking pictures of you? I don't know, but it's illegal for people to be there. Should there be signs warning people for this? Maybe, maybe not. There are in Indonesian signs that it's illegal to go into these areas, it's illegal to take out trees, etc. It's an interesting question if these things are regularly flying over these areas. When we fly, we often go to the villages around the areas where we fly to bring our systems to them, to tell them what we're doing, to see if they're fine with it, to show them the photos, show them the footage. And so far that has been a very positive interaction. But I can of course see that change when somebody from a village would be arrested based on data coming from a drone system. So this is an interesting aspect as well, and we try to do our best to sort of show everybody what we're doing, but of course we can't tell everyone, especially not people that go illegally into an area, because we don't know that they're planning to do that. So there's no real system for that. Is it acceptable to monitor people from the air in these areas? I don't know. Is it acceptable to monitor their actions and then act upon that? I'm not aware of legislation in those countries that specifically deals with those kind of things. Does the fact that they're illegally in these areas make a difference or not? Should we be using these privacy impact assessments as researchers and conservation people when flying over these areas? I don't know either. And how does it link into things that we've been doing for years, monitoring areas from satellites, which are getting higher resolution all the time? We monitor logging with that over large areas and then use that to give it to park authorities, and they act upon that. There's Global Forest Watch now with 16-day interval alerts of where areas are being logged or not. And park authorities act upon those as well. How does drone work link into that kind of work? How does it link to camera traps? We have been using those for years, and nobody's, as far as I know, has ever mentioned any privacy issues to conservation people and biologists using these systems. And they, as I said, take pictures where you can very clearly recognize people. And there must be tens of thousands of images with conservation people, with people on these pictures that are in parks. What about remote microphones? People are using those in in protected areas now more and more to collect data on gunshots, on chainsaws and other sounds, and act upon those. How does that link into privacy? And what about what we've been doing for years, is to take pictures of people when they're illegally operating in a forest, or their actions. And is it really different if a drone flies over an area and take pictures of illegal actions or people than me being in a forest and taking a picture of that same person or that same effect of that person on a forest? I don't know, but I think it's something we probably should be starting to think about. And it's interesting that now, because of the usage of drones, people are starting to think about these things. But previously it didn't happen, and I find that just fascinating because people in my field just haven't been thinking about that much. And now we're more and more being asked about this, rightfully so. So we should try to think about a framework where we can operate in, and that's going to be complicated because we operate in so many countries, so it's going to be very, very interesting. So thank you very much. That was it.
Okay, thank you. Before we go to the question session, we'll turn to the moderator for a response. Kristin Bergtora Sandvik from the Peace Research Institute Oslo in Norway, and also the Centre Director for the Norwegian Centre for Humanitarian Studies.
Is it on? Yeah. Oops. I should also do full disclosure. I'm also an advisory board member for Waviators, which is this global humanitarian drone pilot network where I serve the role as Grumpy Cat, and I'll keep performing the Grumpy Cat here. So that was really excellent and very, very interesting. It's difficult to find people saying very intelligent things across a range of non-military uses, and you all performed excellently. It was very fascinating. So I have a couple of questions for each of you, and I'll start with Katie. The first concerns the role of the citizen journalist. Over Christmas, you saw this campaign by FAA and the drone industry being now very worried about Jill and Joe and Jack having drones, right? So instead of having, the drone creating public order, you now have this sort of popular user creating public disorder. And I was interested in how you see roles and responsibilities of the citizen journalist. And by extension, what is your responsibility with respect to the material you get from a citizen journalist, in particular in light of your ability to triangulate with different kinds of information? And thirdly, what will it take to sort of educate the citizen journalist as that becomes sort of this kind of heroic social identity? The second was for Austin, and again, fascinating. And I was wondering about the scope of conversations we need, because I'm quite a promoter of having silo conversations. A humanitarian drone is very different from a peacekeeping drone, for example, and this is more to my field. Humanitarians are interested in having humanitarian space where they're seen as neutral, where they do no harm. Peacekeeping drones, on the other hand, are now deployed along with UN peacekeeping forces that have very aggressive mandates to use all necessary means. I mean, they have snipers, right? And then you have a human rights community drone, which is, again, a very different thing, operating in a very different setting under a different set of rules. So I agree we need sort of a broader conversation of sorts, but also I'm very interested in having silo conversations and not having people borrow sort of legitimacy tags, as I call them. Not saying that this is a humanitarian use and this is a humanitarian use and this is a humanitarian use, because I do think it's important that each community does take this up by its own. And also I would be interested to hear more about your thoughts about what kind of new skills are called for in the human rights activist community, because I think you really pointed to some very interesting possibilities. But I mean, my background, I was, children's rights activist 20 years ago, and that was a completely different world than what we're facing today in terms of being functional. I mean, my work was with trafficking and sex tourism. I mean, you could do a lot of interesting things on a beach of the Philippines with a drone to trying to map who's doing what. But it's about skill sets and ethics. Apostolos, I think you gave a really interesting sort of utopian view of what a drone could do. But it's really clear that this also has a very high level of technical functionality. I mean, I think you demonstrated this really well. And also I noticed that this is, your example was from the bourgeois wanting to guard their summer houses. And I was interested in if you could say something more about what you think is going to be the future of collective uses and what kind of communities. I mean, if this is going to be a gated community use, there are different aspects kicking in, I think. And finally, Serge, I think that was really interesting. There are two issues here. I mean, the first one, and I'm going to address you as a representative of an industry, not your particular profession or not your particular presentation. The first is this cross-cultural privacy issue, which I'm sure has been discussed intensely at this conference since its inception. In the context of drones discussions in other places, I've heard people say things like Africans do not have privacy, they're not interested. And that is a horrible, horrible statement in my view. On the other hand, I do think you are correct that people have various conceptions of what's private, what's public, and things that we think are public might be private, and that the laws reflect this, or just a total absence of laws. But how can we go about this? I mean, I think for drones to be integrated, and this goes for all of you, I mean, you cannot, and this is my experience, that a lot of manufacturers, smaller manufacturers, are quite happy to put their drone in their backpack, take it through customs without telling anyone, flying in airspace without permission, and having very sketchy views of how well they are insured. And I think, you know, if you want to get respected, I mean, there are no shortcuts. I mean, you cannot just not fly, contrary to the wishes of local municipality authorities, for example. The second thing I was interested in hearing you say a little bit more about is this example we just discussed upstairs, of a more militarized form of the struggle against poaching and the role of drones. And there was an example last year of I think Dutch TV being called in to record the use of drones to survey poachers, and then these poachers were identified and then subsequently killed. I mean, I think most people don't quite know that there is this war going on in a lot of natural reservations, particularly in Africa, where people are killed on every side every day. But drones potentially serve a very problematic role, which is starting to look a bit like a military drone, even though it's just surveillance technology. And then you're having a completely different conversation, which I think conservationists need to be on the ball to actually control that conversation. So thank you, but great presentations, all of you.
Thank you, Kristen. We'll ask for quite quick responses, please, from the speakers, so that we still have time for some questions from the floor. Okay.
I will be quick. The citizen journalism question is especially pertinent in the U.S. because the FAA is treating journalism as a commercial use. It's defined we make no money. Well, most of us make no money, but we're a commercial use. So hobbyists currently have an exception. A hobbyist can fly a drone, and so that transforms a hobbyist into a citizen journalist. So if I want to get that, being able to get that Harlem gas explosion video, that hobbyist could do it. The Daily News could not do it. The FAA is now saying that it will pursue enforcement actions against journalistic entities that obtain content from hobbyists, and that's hugely problematic in a number of ways. I mean, it opens all sorts of floodgates. I would say, excuse me, that when it comes to the citizen journalists, we're talking about a big emerging area of media ethics, and that's the ethics of public communicators. So, it used to be access to the means of communication limited the number of people who had to think about these questions, and now that's limitless. So we're talking about people having to think about minimizing harm, transparency, accountability, independence, all of those questions, and they're far beyond the bounds of news organization. And so news organizations opening up those questions, those accountability questions, those ethics questions, serves an important purpose. I would finally say that we've long talked about media ethics being the responsible use of the freedom to publish. And when I think about drones, I think about it also being the responsible use of the freedom to gather. So gathering information presents a set of questions, even if you never ultimately do anything with the information that you've gathered.
Great. So two things that you raised. One of them is speaking across these silos. And so I probably didn't emphasize this clearly enough. I think there are three silos of conversation, and one of them is the military use, one of them is a commercial use, and the other is a use for, let's say, the greater good or civil society use or citizen journalists, this sort of thing. So my observations were speaking in particular to that set of uses. Obviously, the do no harm principle is hard to impose on a reaper, right? I mean, so this doesn't scale parallel in any way to the United States use of militarized weaponized drones. There is a conversation about whether or not small, light crafts should be weaponized and how those can be used by, let's say, sort of police departments, for example. And that's a conversation where some of these lines would start to blur. So I'm with you for some of the siloing across these three major sectors. It's more between humanitarians and journalists, where I'm saying this could be a conversation. So we can talk about that offline if you disagree. New skills in the human rights community. More folks who come from the STEMs and are studying human rights, for example. So, I mean, this is the broadest level kind of answer, but I currently need somebody who can code in Python. I currently need somebody who I can hand a task to, and they can just get my crowdsourcing sort of coding of some of this data running for a co-authored piece, and I don't have like a student in a school of public policy that I can pivot to, right? Because we have a handful of students who are coming from Samsung and from industry and who have developed apps, but there's only a handful of them. We're just starting to see a trickle of students who come from science, technology, engineering, this sort of thing. And so that's what I really could use more of. And so human rights folks who don't have English majors like me, but actually are coming from electrical engineering.
So community use of drones. So first of all, to start with, okay, neighborhood watch is not a very common paradigm here in Europe, but in the States it's more of a commodity. It's a common thing in many big cities and towns, and so it might seem bourgeois for us, but maybe in the States it's not that much, I assume. Even the term will not be used. We can also we consider this particular scenario because of the context where we're working. It's a security institute. But we can clearly envisage scenarios where you have students you can teach in a class or a university class sharing a drone, or communities of activists that don't have enough of resources but have one drone to do with their own monitoring of city projects and so forth. So, okay, we clearly don't see it. I personally don't see it as becoming as a commodity as open Wi-Fi. You have a drone, you go in, you log in, and you launch it and you monitor things. But it might become an object that will be shared amongst people in neighborhoods and friends and groups of friends.
Yeah, about the cross-cultural privacy issues, I think it's something we should just study more and understand it better. What you hear in the UK often, for instance, if people fly a drone over a residential area and there's pictures, people say, "Oh, that's my house," and then people can see my backyard. I've never heard that in Indonesia, for instance, when there are pictures of a village, people are usually, "Oh, that's funny. I can see my house, and this is nice, and this is great. I love these pictures. I'll put it on the wall." And that shows that there seems to be a difference. They don't seem to bring up that this is a sort of a potentially a privacy issue. They certainly are differences there that we just need to understand. And I think studying them, having questionnaires, going out there, asking people what they think, how to feel about this. So that means conservation is working with social scientists to understand that better, and with cultural anthropologists, etc., to get a better sense of how this works. Because I think that's obviously very important, and that's why we go into villages and talk to people and try to get not a very scientific understanding, but at least a good feel of what people say, and if they don't like it, we won't fly. I mean, it's very simple. The poaching issue, wow, it's a big, it's a difficult issue in the Virunga National Park, where the last mountain gorillas are. Over the past decade, 140 park rangers have been shot, and I find that amazing. So there are people there that earn not a very high salary by being a park ranger, and that are very willingly putting their life on the line. And a lot of those people would probably say, well, if we can get some better intelligence that we can prevent us being killed and striking first, that would be good. But there's other people that would argue the opposite, that we should not probably provide that technology for that. But is the question then also becomes, I guess, is a drone very different from other data gathering means? A guy with a pair of binoculars standing high up on a tower. I don't know, but it's something we need to discuss.
Thanks very much. We have still quite a few minutes for questions from the floor. I can't see very well, so please. Who wants to take it?
I think that probably there, for research, there will be a moment where we'll have to start doing those kind of things, just because the universities and research institutes will require those kind of things, like they require a lot of other things we need to do when we present a research proposal, ethical questions, privacy, as you said. So it will probably happen at some stage. How and at what level, I don't know. There'll probably be discussions within universities about those kind of things. As this drone use is becoming more common and more research groups are using them for a whole range of issues. But I definitely see it coming at some stage. So I think it's good for the scientists to try to be involved in that discussion, and not that all of a sudden it's imposed upon us by the higher levels at research institutes.
I'm definitely in the same line with Serge here, so I definitely see this coming in the next few years, although I would find it extremely challenging to classify an application, as you mentioned before, as recreational, commercial, or governmental use, given the wealth of and the plethora of data and the diversity of the data that we're collecting, and the possible and expected ways of people that are going to exploit and utilize them in different ways. Yeah, you might end up doing something at the beginning, but come up with something completely different at the end. So that would be the tricky point, I think.
More questions? Anybody? Yes, please.
This question is going to be updating. Do you worry that some of the limitations we're talking about, privacy of drones, do you worry about, or how do you prevent those limitations from being to a place where it's constraining freedom of the press? Where you're basically saying, hey, now these things which are ostensibly publicly available information, that anybody can see and in order to see, they now become ways of constraining journalists from covering legitimate stories, that they're used as a springboard for other limitations of journalistic activity, maybe not drone related, but that can be analogized to observation.
You just raised my favorite question. I'm going to try not to sermonize. So I'm all about free expression, and I'm not talking in any way about a regulatory scheme, about government involvement in this whatsoever. None. I'm talking about journalistic ethics. So we constrain ourselves internally all the time, daily, every day. In fact, every minute of every day. Right now, in the last second, hundreds of journalists constrained their own freedom. They made ethical choices to responsibly use that freedom. And that's, I think, something that I really worry is missing from the conversation. We tend to default to, I have the freedom. Oh, he interrupted my sermon. Dang it. Okay, but I got a bell ringer there. So I absolutely will work until my dying day to guarantee free expression. But we have to focus on the responsible use of that freedom. And so when I talk about the responsible use of the freedom to publish and the responsible use of the freedom to gather, it's that latter one where we have to be thinking about the implications for privacy, even if we don't do anything with that information. So if I were to, launch a drone over a public beach and continually surveil and take video or still images or capture sound, any of that, there are implications of that for the people on that beach, even if I don't ever broadcast that footage. And that's what I'm talking about. That's what we need to be thinking about. So not government censorship in any way, but media focusing on that responsible use and focusing on the implications of their actions.
I was sitting here and thinking a little bit more about those social movements. So the Italians are getting their Reapers and Predators back from war, and they're going to use them for border management and for crowd control. And there are reports that the Greeks are buying also drones to use for crowd control. And more governments are. And you know, in hindsight, the human rights community has probably gotten off quite lightly in terms of the photographic material they have published over the years, in terms of considering individuals' privacy, quite graphic pictures of victims, etc., etc. But what's the difference between the crowd control footage of a demonstration and our crowd footage from a demonstration, given that it's probably going to be circulated and available? And particularly also in light of a lot of NGOs getting supported by grants and sort of technical support from Amazon, Google, big philanthropy that, you know, obviously have commercial interests.
So the question is, what's the difference between these two uses? And the brief answer in my mind is use and storage. And so the question becomes, if I have this footage and the NSA is reading my email anyway, then they have this footage and they can do what they want with it, right? So there's this like tertiary issue of what happens to weapons of war when they come home. This is half of the Ferguson story, which is that sort of local police forces have been up-armed to the point where they look like SEAL teams. They look like the average Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, when what they're really doing is part of the community, helping the community together to solve collective action problems around crime. That's really what they are, but instead they're up-armored to the point of sort of illegibility in terms of being community members. So one issue is what happens when we repatriate weapons, and this we don't know how to figure out. The United States is a good warning example there. But the second question is, how will this footage be used differently? And we just need more case uses, because what I hope doesn't happen is that this sort of footage gets appropriated by the state. It's taken from me licitly or illicitly. I'm sued for it, this sort of thing. Now the good news is there's no faces here, so this is good. But there's nothing to stop the law and order wing of the riot control and safety community, which is part of the community I'm in. When I consult with social movement scholars who are working on crowd control and estimating crowd size, half of what they're doing is consulting for police forces in order to ensure that if something goes wrong, if the Knicks lose a game, if Manchester United loses a game, people don't hit the gates and crush each other, right? So these communities talk to each other, but for very different reasons. One is law and order, which quickly trickles into surveillance if necessary, and the other is in the interest of what I'm calling the greater good. How we parse those things out is very, very difficult, and I don't think we have enough case use to actually start doing this with data. And how we get to the data, last point, is how we get to the data is a puzzle, because there are these risk and reward things, right? When is there a trade-off between taking this innovation slowly, responsibly, having very clear answers to questions about audits around privacy, and when do we learn as much as we can? What's the balance there? And I don't know what that balance is, and I'm happy if you want to meet me afterwards to tell me the answer.
If I could just add one other journalistic critique to that, and that is, I don't think that journalism is doing a very good job of helping us have these conversations right now. So, for instance, in all of the coverage of the militarization of U.S. police forces that finally came about after Ferguson, during and after Ferguson, I don't recall a single question about whether law enforcement drones can be weaponized or will be weaponized. But that's an active question everywhere else. I mean, talk to anyone who studies this, and it's a primary question, and yet it's not something that we're covering and discussing in news. And I think that's a real failing.
We could have a very quick question, or otherwise we will close. Okay, we close. Thanks very much.